The wind does not merely blow, it screams. It is the winter of 1788 in the high French Alps, and the air has turned into a weapon of solid, blinding white ice. Outside the stone walls of a small, isolated cabin, the temperature has plummeted to a lethal low. Giant, ancient pines snap in the dark under the sheer weight of the frost. The ground itself is frozen so deeply that it threatens to pull the very warmth from the marrow of anyone standing upon it. Yet, inside the dim, flickering light of a lone tallow candle, an elderly widow sits directly on the earthen floor. She is not shivering. She is not huddled beneath a mountain of heavy animal pelts. Instead, she is calmly pressing her bare palm against the smooth, curved glass of an empty wine bottle buried beneath the dirt. While the rest of the valley faces the absolute terror of the encroaching permafrost, her cabin radiates a strange, impossible heat. The secret to her survival lies buried completely beneath her feet, a secret that, just 3 months prior, made her the absolute laughingstock of the entire mountain village. It began in the fading, golden weeks of autumn. The harvest had been agonizingly poor. The village elders warned of a harsh, unforgiving season ahead, pointing to the unusually thick coats on the mountain wolves and the early, panicked migration of the ravens. In response, the men of the valley swung their heavy iron axes from dawn until dusk. They felled countless trees, splitting dense pine timber until their hands blistered and bled. They built massive, towering pyres of firewood against the stone walls of their homes. They slaughtered their remaining livestock, salting the meat and hoarding every scrap of thick, heavy wool they could find. They prepared to fight the cold with brute force and roaring hearths. But Genevieve, a solitary woman left to face the brutal mountain alone after the sudden passing of her husband, did not swing an axe. She did not hunt. Instead, she took a creaking wooden handcart and began a slow, grueling descent into the lower, more populated towns. She did not return with sacks of grain. She did not return with heavy loads of black coal. She returned, day after day, dragging a cart filled with the town's discarded refuse, empty, corkless apothecary vials, discarded wine bottles tossed out by the local taverns, thick, heavy green glass jugs that once held cheap oil. The rhythmic, hollow clinking of glass echoed through the valley every evening, announcing her return. The villagers watched from their porches, chuckling behind their calloused hands. They whispered that the solitude of the mountain, combined with her quiet grief, had finally broken her mind. They openly mocked the fragile widow, who chose to collect brittle, useless glass, while a deadly, historic freeze loomed just over the jagged horizon. They simply could not comprehend her actions. They did not understand that Genevieve was not building a hoard of fragile trash. She was carefully, meticulously engineering an invisible shield. The first true sign of the coming apocalypse did not arrive with a violent storm, but with a silent, creeping frost that painted the edges of the pine needles, a brittle, ghostly white. The crisp autumn air lost its gentle bite and began to carry a deep, metallic ache. In the valley below, the frenzied chopping of wood reached a fever pitch, echoing like 100 frantic war drums against the steep canyon walls. But inside the cramped, shadowy confines of Genevieve's cabin, a very different kind of labor was just beginning. She stood in the center of her single room, holding a rusted, heavy iron spade. Her cabin floor was made of packed, hardened earth, tamped down by decades of heavy leather boots and the relentless march of time. It was as solid as bedrock. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she drove the iron edge of the spade into the dirt. The impact sent a painful, vibrating shockwave straight up her thin arms, rattling her bones. The earth yielded only a fraction of an inch. It was going to be an agonizingly slow process. For 3 days and 3 nights, lit only by the sputtering, greasy orange flame of a tallow candle, she dug. The scrape of metal against stone became her only companion. She knelt in the dark, using a small hand trowel when the long-handled spade became too heavy, scraping away the dirt inch by stubborn inch. Her knuckles swelled, turning red and raw, the skin peeling away to reveal painful blisters that she simply wrapped in strips of torn, coarse linen. She was excavating a massive, shallow trench across the entire footprint of her living space, working her way down until she had carved out a hollow pit, nearly 1.5 feet deep. The smell of the raw, exposed earth was overwhelmingly potent, a damp, ancient scent of decaying roots and cold, dormant clay. With every bucket of heavy, wet soil she hauled out into the biting wind, she felt the oppressive weight of the creeping frost trying to invade her home. The dirt piled up outside her wooden door, a dark, muddy mound that the passing villagers stared at with open bewilderment. They pointed heavy, calloused fingers at her from the main road, shaking their heads in sheer disbelief. "She is digging her own grave," the village baker muttered, pulling his thick wool cloak tighter around his neck. The widow has surrendered to the mountain, but Genevieve had not surrendered. She was preparing a battlefield. Down in the damp trench, the cold was already seeping up from the deep earth. She could feel the ambient temperature of the ground threatening to steal the warmth from her aching joints. This was the silent killer of the Alps. The villagers believed that the cold only attacked from the howling winds outside, battering against their wooden walls. But the true danger lay below. The permafrost acts like a giant frozen sponge, relentlessly absorbing every ounce of radiant heat through the floorboards. Genevieve knew that no matter how high a fire roared in the hearth, a frozen floor would slowly, inevitably, suck the life out of a room. To sever this deadly connection to the freezing earth, she needed a foundation. Early the next morning, under a sky the color of bruised iron, she began hauling heavy, canvas sacks of coarse river sand up the steep, winding path from the valley basin. The rough fabric of the sacks cut viciously into her shoulders, the dead weight of the wet sand threatening to drag her to her knees with every faltering step. She gritted her teeth, a low hum of determination vibrating in her throat, her breath blooming into thick, white clouds in the freezing air. Once inside the cabin, she poured the sand into the bottom of her excavated pit. The wet, slapping sound of the heavy grit hitting the damp earth felt like a victory. She fell to her knees, dragging a flat, heavily scarred plank of oak across the sand. She pushed and pulled, sweating in the freezing room, until the layer of coarse sand was perfectly, immaculately level. It had to be flawless. If there was even a single uneven mound, a single protruding stone hidden in the grit, the immense pressure of a human footstep would eventually find it, and the fragile glass she planned to lay would shatter into 1,000 useless shards. With the foundational bed finally prepared, Genevieve turned her attention to the massive, chaotic mountain of discarded glass she had hoarded in the corner of her room. Hundreds of bottles. Deep emerald green wine bottles, stout brown apothecary jugs, and clear, delicate vials. They were filthy, caked in mud, dried cobwebs, and the sticky residue of forgotten liquids. Sitting on a small wooden stool, she began the tedious process of inspecting every single vessel. She held each bottle up to the flickering light of her hearth, rotating it slowly, her eyes searching frantically for the slightest hairline fracture. A cracked bottle would allow air to flow, and moving air meant a transfer of temperature. Moving air meant death. Only the perfectly intact, completely sealed chambers of glass would survive the brutal physics of the coming freeze. She carefully wiped each chosen bottle with a dry rag, the sharp, high-pitched squeak of clean glass echoing in the silent, cold cabin. The wind outside began to howl just a little louder, a grim reminder that her time was rapidly running out. Genevieve knelt at the edge of the sanded pit, the coarse grains biting into her bruised knees through her thin woolen skirt. She reached for a heavy, dark amber apothecary bottle, its thick glass already chilling her stiff fingers. With agonizing care, she laid it perfectly horizontal into the bed of leveled sand. She gently twisted the glass cylinder, nestling it deep into the grit until it lay entirely flush, unable to roll or shift even a fraction of a millimeter. Then, she took a second bottle, a long, slender green wine vessel, and laid it flush against the first. The faint, muted clink of glass touching glass rang out in the quiet cabin. It was a delicate, dangerous masonry. If the bottles were spaced too far apart, the earthen floor above would eventually sag and cave. If they were forced too tightly against one another, the pressure of a human footstep would cause a catastrophic chain reaction, shattering the entire subterranean grid into razor-sharp shrapnel. She had to find the absolute perfect equilibrium, relying solely on the sensitive touch of her raw, trembling fingertips in the dim light. But placing the glass was only half the battle. The true magic of her survival depended on the air trapped inside them. Before each bottle was laid into the earth, it had to be hermetically sealed. An open bottle was useless. It would simply allow the freezing air to circulate, acting as a conduit for the frost. Genevieve needed the air to be entirely static, completely trapped, forming an invisible, impenetrable barrier of dead air. Over her small stone hearth, an iron pot bubbled and spat, filling the cabin with the thick, suffocatingly pungent smoke of melting pine pitch and yellow beeswax. The heavy scent of resin clung to her hair and clothes. Taking a whittled wooden cork, she drove it brutally hard into the neck of a bottle, using the flat side of a heavy river stone as a makeshift mallet. Then, grasping the bottle by its base, she dipped the neck straight into the boiling, viscous pitch. The black tar hissed violently as it coated the glass, hardening almost instantly in the frigid air of the room. She was effectively capturing the autumn air, entombing it in glass and hardened resin, creating hundreds of tiny, individual fortresses against the cold. The physical toll of this relentless, repetitive labor was immense. Hour after hour, row after row, she crawled backward across the sand. Her spine burned with a dull, throbbing ache that radiated up into the base of her skull. Her hands were slick with grease, coated in black tar, and covered in dozens of tiny, stinging cuts from handling the sharp edges of slightly chipped glass. Outside her wooden walls, the mountain was growing increasingly hostile. The wind had shifted, bringing with it the first hard flurries of snow. The flakes were not soft and drifting. They were hard, frozen pellets that whipped against the timber like handfuls of thrown gravel. Through the small, iced-over pane of her window, Genevieve could see the distant, hazy orange glow of the village below. Massive, roaring bonfires had been lit in the town square. Thick columns of black wood smoke billowed into the darkening sky. The villagers were burning through their precious winter fuel reserves at a terrifying rate, fighting the plunging temperatures with sheer, desperate volume. They were exhausting their firewood, while the true winter had not even fully arrived. Ignoring the pain lacing through her joints, Genevieve focused strictly on the grid. Slowly, a mesmerizing pattern emerged in the dirt. Hundreds of gleaming, sealed glass bottles lay in perfectly arranged, tight geometric rows, covering the entire expanse of her cabin floor. They looked like the scales of a massive, subterranean serpent resting beneath the earth. But the glass could not remain exposed. Leaving the bottles bare would mean certain destruction the moment she walked across them. Reaching for her heavy canvas sacks once again, she began the painstaking process of burying her creation. She poured the remaining river sand over the glass grid, handful by slow, agonizing handful. The soft, sibilant hiss of sand spilling over the smooth glass filled the room. She used a small, soft-bristled brush made of bound pine needles to sweep the grit down into the tiny crevices between the bottles, locking them into a rigid, immovable matrix. The dead air was now fully submerged, waiting in the dark to perform a feat of thermal physics that the freezing villagers below could not possibly fathom. The final layer of protection required a delicate, terrifying brutality. Genevieve hauled heavy wooden buckets of dry, sifted clay into the cabin, dumping them carefully over the smoothed bed of sand. The fine, dusty powder rose into the freezing air, coating her eyelashes and leaving a chalky, bitter taste on her cracked lips. She spread the clay evenly, creating a thick, dense cap over the hidden glass grid. But loose earth is entirely useless against the heavy tread of daily life. It had to be densely compacted. She lifted a heavy, flat-bottomed section of a stripped pine log. This was the most dangerous moment of the entire grueling process. She had to tamp the earth down until it was as hard as stone, but if she struck the ground with too much raw force, the kinetic shockwave would travel straight down through the clay, violently displace the sand, and instantly shatter the fragile glass vessels resting below. She raised the heavy log. Her breath caught tightly in her throat. She brought it down. Thump. A dull, muted thud echoed through the dark cabin. She waited, her ears straining against the low rumble of the wind outside. Silence. No sound of breaking glass. She moved the log a few inches and struck again. Thump. Hour after agonizing hour, she pounded the floor. Her shoulders burned with a deep fire that brought involuntary tears to her eyes, sweat freezing on her brow despite the intense, heated labor. She was literally beating the earth into submission over a fragile, hidden void. By the time she finished, a full week had vanished into the biting, merciless grip of late November. The world outside her frost-covered window had transformed into a hostile, alien landscape. The ambient temperature plummeted so rapidly that the sap trapped deep inside the massive alpine pines froze and expanded, causing the enormous tree trunks to violently split open. The resulting cracks echoed down the mountain, sounding exactly like musket fire in the dead of night. The fast-flowing river at the base of the canyon, usually a roaring torrent of deafening white water, was shocked into complete, eerie silence, frozen absolutely solid beneath a foot of thick, cloudy ice. Down in the valley below, the village was heavily barricaded. Heavy wooden shutters were nailed shut over windows. Thick, black smoke vomited endlessly from every stone chimney, staining the gray sky with dark soot as the desperate families burned through their winter timber at a catastrophic, unsustainable pace. They were fighting the mountain blindly, trying to beat back the encroaching permafrost with sheer brute flame. Inside the cabin, the floor was finally complete. To the naked eye, it looked completely unremarkable. It was just a flat, hard-packed dirt floor, identical in every visible way to the one she had torn up weeks ago. But beneath the dark surface lay an invisible, primitive shield. Genevieve stood by her cold hearth, her legs trembling violently from exhaustion. It was time to test the massive weight of her gamble. She slowly stepped forward. She placed her heavy, leather-wrapped foot directly onto the center of the newly packed earth. She closed her eyes tight. Slowly, she shifted her entire body weight onto that single foot. The cabin was deathly quiet. She held her breath, waiting for the sickening, crunching sound of 100 glass bottles violently collapsing under her boots. But the sound never came. The floor felt completely solid, unyielding, and incredibly firm. The dense layers of packed clay and coarse river sand distributed her weight perfectly across the massive grid of curved, resilient glass. The rustic engineering was a total, silent triumph. She collapsed into her creaking wooden rocking chair, wrapping a heavy, moth-eaten woolen shawl tightly around her thin shoulders. Her brutal labor was finally over. Now, there was nothing left to do but wait. And the mountain did not make her wait long. 2 days later, the relentless, howling wind suddenly stopped. An oppressive, suffocating silence fell over the high French Alps. The sky above turned a sickly, bruised purple, heavy and swollen with unimaginable moisture. The air grew so incredibly thick and still that it felt hard to pull into the lungs. It was the terrifying, deathly calm before a historical catastrophe. The deep freeze of 1788 was finally about to unleash its full devastating fury upon the valley. The storm hit not with a roar, but with a blinding, suffocating avalanche of solid white. Within minutes, the distant, hazy lights of the valley below were entirely swallowed by the blizzard. The snow did not drift gently from the sky. It was driven horizontally by gale-force winds that shrieked viciously through the gaps in the timber. The temperature plummeted so fast it felt like a heavy physical blow to the chest. Inside the dark cabin, the moisture from Genevieve's ragged breathing crystallized instantly in the freezing air, falling as a fine, glittering diamond dust onto her thick woolen shawl. The heavy oak door, banded in iron, froze solidly into its frame within the first hour, sealing her inside a dark wooden tomb. The extreme, sudden drop in temperature caused the very structure of her home to groan in sheer agony. Thick iron nails, forged by the local blacksmith, violently popped out of the wooden beams, with a sound exactly like snapping bones, contracting aggressively in the bitter frost. A thick, opaque layer of frost began to rapidly crawl up the interior stone of her walls, forming a jagged, crystalline spiderweb of creeping, silent ice. Genevieve moved slowly, her stiff joints popping as she approached her stone hearth. She did not build a towering, roaring bonfire like the desperate, panicked men in the valley. She simply could not afford to. Her winter fuel stockpile was dangerously, almost laughably, limited. Instead, she carefully arranged 3 small, dry logs of split white birch, packing them tightly with a meager handful of brittle pine needles. She struck her heavy iron flint against a jagged rock. A tiny, fragile spark caught the tinder. A weak, wavering orange flame slowly crept to life in the dark. It was a pathetic, terribly small fire. In any ordinary cabin on this unforgiving mountain, a fire this small during a historic, generational blizzard would mean a slow, freezing death long before the dawn. The radiant heat generated by the 3 small logs should have been instantly absorbed, sucked down, and utterly neutralized by the freezing earthen floor. But Genevieve's floor was no longer ordinary earth. She sat heavily in her creaking rocking chair, pulling her rough shawl tighter against her neck, and watched the small flames dance against the deep black soot. Down in the suffocating darkness of the village, a slow, freezing nightmare was rapidly unfolding. The massive, roaring hearths were betraying the townspeople. The intense heat from their fires radiated upward, completely escaping through their poorly insulated thatched roofs, while the deadly, creeping permafrost relentlessly sucked the remaining warmth downward into the dirt. The dense cold seeped through their floors with terrifying speed. Their heavy leather boots literally froze fast to their own wooden floorboards. The sheer volume of the snow was burying the village alive, drifting high up over the window panes and completely blocking out the pale moonlight. Desperate fathers tore the very furniture from their walls, heavy oak chairs, dining tables, carved wooden heirlooms, hurling them violently into the flames in a panicked, sweating frenzy to keep the freezing dark at bay. The cold was attacking them mercilessly from below, an invisible, subterranean monster, sinking its icy fangs deeply into their numb feet and aching legs. They huddled tightly together, shivering uncontrollably, trapped inside their freezing wooden boxes as the relentless snow buried their front doors. But high on the lonely, windswept ridge, completely surrounded by a howling vortex of lethal white wind, Genevieve simply sat and waited. She listened to the wind shrieking like a wounded animal violently tearing at her wooden roof shingles. The ultimate, terrifying test of her hidden grid was rapidly approaching. The ambient cold in the room was sharp enough to bite mercilessly at her nose and the tips of her ears, yet her feet, resting entirely still on the packed dirt floor, felt absolutely no such pain. The deep, penetrating, bone-crushing chill of the mountain earth was entirely missing. The barrier was holding fast. The thousands of sealed glass chambers hidden just beneath her boots were stubbornly refusing to transfer the deadly cold. The static, trapped air was forming an absolute, invisible shield between the frozen core of the earth and the small, vital pocket of warmth radiating from her meager hearth. But the storm outside was only just gathering its true, monstrous strength. The longest, deadliest night of the century had barely even begun. The absolute apex of the historic 1,788 blizzard struck the high French Alps deep in the pitch-black hours of midnight. It did not merely snow. The sky violently emptied itself, crushing the jagged mountainside beneath a suffocating, moving ocean of heavy, wet ice. The sheer auditory violence of the storm was completely, utterly deafening. The screaming wind battered against Genevieve's small wooden cabin with the relentless, rhythmic thud of a massive physical battering ram. Thick, ancient pine trees surrounding her isolated clearing, giants that had stood perfectly tall and proud for over 2 centuries, violently snapped in half under the immense, crushing weight of the ice. Their massive, splintering trunks crashed heavily into the deep snowdrifts with a muffled, earth-shaking boom that vibrated deep in Genevieve's chest. Inside the cramped cabin, the single, trembling orange flame of her incredibly small hearth threw long, distorted, dancing shadows across the heavily frosted timber walls. The temperature outside had plummeted into the deadly, unimaginable depths where exposed human flesh freezes entirely solid within mere minutes. The extreme frost aggressively chewed at the heavy wooden door, the cold attempting to claw its way inside her small, isolated sanctuary like a living, breathing beast. Genevieve sat perfectly still in her rocking chair, listening intently to the chaotic destruction of the entire world outside. Slowly, she reached down, sliding her bare, calloused hand over the dark, packed clay of her floor. It was not hot, but crucially, terribly crucially, it was not freezing. It held a neutral, incredibly steady temperature, completely detached from the lethal, biting frost raging just inches beyond her foundation. Down in the valley, the desperate village was losing its brutal, exhausting war against the deep freeze. Their massive, roaring hearths, fueled by sheer panic and the last of their precious winter timber, were finally burning out. One by one, the chimneys stopped vomiting thick black smoke into the violent sky. As the fires slowly died down to a faint, glowing bed of orange embers, the true, silent terror of the permafrost invaded their homes. The ground beneath their stone cabins, a deep, frozen mass of solid earth, began to relentlessly pull the remaining ambient warmth straight down into the dirt. Water pitchers resting on heavy wooden dining tables froze completely solid, the expanding ice violently shattering the thick ceramic into jagged, useless pieces. The breath of sleeping children turned to thick, white frost on their heavy wool blankets. Strong, heavily bearded men huddled tightly in the corners of their pitch-black rooms, their teeth chattering violently, weeping silent tears of sheer frustration as the cold slowly crept up from the soles of their leather boots, gnawing aggressively at their numb ankles and knees. They had chopped enough wood to last an ordinary winter, but they had fundamentally misunderstood their enemy. They fought the howling wind outside, completely blind to the fact that the earth beneath their very feet was the true, silent thief, stealing their vital warmth. The cold was an insatiable parasite, and without a barrier, the villagers were defenseless against the frozen ground. For 3 agonizing, blindingly white weeks, the historic blizzard held the mountain gorge completely hostage. Day and night blended into one continuous, howling nightmare of flying ice and suffocating darkness. Inside her sealed wooden box, Genevieve fell into a slow, incredibly deliberate rhythm of primitive survival. She boiled handfuls of dried, bitter pine needles in a small iron pot, the sharp, medicinal steam filling the tiny room and keeping her lungs clear of the heavy, stagnant air. She fed her small, remarkably efficient fire with excruciating care, placing only a single, thin branch of white birch onto the glowing embers every few hours. Her winter fuel supply, which the arrogant men of the valley had loudly mocked as a pathetic, suicidal joke, barely shrank. Because her floor entirely refused to absorb the radiant heat of the small flames, the ambient warmth became perfectly trapped inside the small cabin, bouncing gently off the clay and lingering heavily in the air. Finally, on the dawn of the 22nd day, the shrieking wind abruptly died. The heavy, dark storm clouds suddenly fractured, breaking apart to reveal a piercingly bright, painful blue sky. The horrific silence that followed was heavier than the storm itself. Down in the decimated, half-buried village, a small group of surviving men, their faces heavily wrapped in dirty, frost-covered rags, strapped on wide, woven snowshoes. They carried heavy iron pry bars and a long, tightly rolled burial shroud made of coarse burlap. They began the long, grueling, chest-deep climb up the steep mountain path, fully expecting to find the eccentric widow frozen entirely solid in her dark, icy tomb. The arduous trek up the ridge took them nearly half the day. When the exhausted, frostbitten search party finally crested the hill and saw Genevieve's cabin, a heavy, somber silence fell over the men. The small wooden structure was almost entirely buried beneath a massive, glittering white snowdrift. The stone chimney was dark. No smoke rose into the crisp, freezing air. The village blacksmith, a massive, broad-shouldered man, shivering violently in his thick wolf pelt, waded heavily through the chest-high snow. He drove the heavy, flat edge of his iron pry bar deep into the thick ice sealing the heavy front door. With a loud, agonizing groan of protesting timber and shattering ice, the door violently cracked open. The men braced themselves for the sickening, familiar sight of a frozen corpse. Instead, as the door swung wide, a gentle, incredibly startling wave of deeply warm, dry air washed directly over their numb, frost-bitten faces. It carried the faint, earthy smell of baked clay and dried pine. Sitting calmly in the center of the dimly lit room, holding a steaming wooden mug of hot water, was Genevieve. She was not shivering. She was not wearing her heavy, snow-covered boots. She was sitting in her thin woolen socks, resting her feet directly on the bare dirt. The men stood completely paralyzed in the open doorway, their exhausted minds entirely unable to comprehend the impossible warmth of the room. They stared blankly at the impossibly small pile of firewood resting untouched in the corner. The blacksmith slowly removed a thick, leather mitten, his hand trembling violently from the lingering mountain chill. He knelt down, pressing his raw, cracked palm directly against Genevieve's dirt floor. He gasped loudly, his eyes widening in sheer, utter disbelief. The earth was completely neutral. The lethal, biting sting of the mountain permafrost was entirely gone. What the utterly baffled villagers could not see, and what Genevieve had so brilliantly engineered, was a masterpiece of ancient, primitive physics known as a dead-air thermal break. When the extreme cold of the deep earth tried to rise up and steal the radiant warmth of the cabin, it hit the thick, buried grid of tightly sealed glass bottles. Glass itself is a poor conductor of heat, but the true magic lay inside the empty vessels. The bottles were filled entirely with stagnant, unmoving dead air. Because the air was completely trapped by the hardened pitch and could not circulate, it refused to carry the freezing temperature across the void. It formed an absolute, invisible wall of nothingness. The cold was violently stopped in its tracks, unable to bridge the gap of empty air. Simultaneously, the meager, gentle heat from her incredibly small fire radiated downward, hitting the top layer of hard-packed clay and stopping dead, entirely unable to leak into the freezing earth below. By burying fragile, seemingly useless trash beneath her feet, the mocked widow had successfully disconnected her home from the frozen world, defeating a historically deadly blizzard not with brute force, but with the brilliant, quiet power of empty space. The brutal winter of 1788 eventually broke, the relentless screaming winds softening into a gentle, cold breeze, melting away to reveal the scarred, battered remnants of the high alpine valley. The villagers slowly emerged from their freezing wooden tombs, physically exhausted, completely humiliated, and fundamentally changed. They had chopped entire forests of ancient pine, burning through massive mountains of heavy timber in a blind, desperate, and ultimately failing battle against the deep cold. They had sacrificed their heirloom furniture, their heavy woven blankets, and the very peace of their minds trying to beat back the permafrost with roaring flames. Yet, sitting quietly at the very peak of the harsh mountain, the solitary widow they had so viciously mocked had effortlessly survived, with nothing more than a meager pile of scavenged birch twigs and an absolute mastery of the earth beneath her feet. The men who had laughed at her creaking wooden handcart, who had openly sneered at her meticulous collection of dirty, discarded tavern glass, now stood in profound, quiet awe of her rustic genius. They realized with a deep, lingering shame that brute force is often the loudest, clumsiest, and most ineffective answer to nature's quiet, devastating fury. Genevieve did not fight the brutal mountain. She simply outsmarted it. She understood a fundamental, unwritten law of primitive physics. You cannot defeat the cold by merely shouting at it with fire. You must patiently, quietly build an invisible fortress of nothingness to keep it entirely at bay. Her brilliant, hidden grid of dead air insulation stood as a monumental testament to the enduring, quiet intelligence of our ancient ancestors. This is the profound, beautiful reality of ancient human survival. Long before the heavy, lazy reliance on modern machinery, before the humming electrical wires, the burning furnaces, and the thick, synthetic insulation walls of the present day, our ancestors were absolute masters of their unforgiving environments. They did not have the luxury of pure, overwhelming technological power. They survived by keenly observing the quiet, hidden mechanics of the natural world, turning empty glass, hardened pine pitch, and raw, packed earth into an impregnable shield against certain death. Their incredible life-saving knowledge was not written in heavy, leather-bound academic textbooks or taught in grand, vaulted universities. It was organically forged in the pitch dark, rigorously tested in the biting, lethal cold, and passed down through the heavily calloused hands of those who simply refused to surrender to the elements. Today, modern humanity has paved over the earth with concrete, entirely forgetting the raw, brilliant survival physics that kept our fragile bloodlines alive through the absolute darkest, coldest nights of recorded history. But those forgotten secrets are still out there, buried deep in the silent dirt, waiting quietly beneath the dust of time to be unearthed once again. The past is not just a graveyard of dates and names. It is a sprawling, deeply fascinating blueprint for human endurance. If you felt the biting, terrifying chill of the 1788 blizzard and want to continue uncovering the brilliant lost survival secrets of the forgotten past, simply leave your mark upon this channel. Subscribe and join us as we pull back the heavy, velvet veil of history, stepping together into the quiet, fascinating darkness to rediscover the hidden genius of those who walked the frozen earth before us.